Since the absolute beginning of the entire nationwide invasion, including within the South Central invasion sector as a whole, which within it included the battle that erupted in Albuquerque, as this was an absolutely vital node along a key invasion route to control, as well as also possessing one of the biggest objectives in the entire invasion, which lay beneath the Kirtland Air Force Base, which had been conquered and captured within the first 2 hours alone due to the enormity of the air power that was used against it, primarily the JH-7 squadron, as each single JH-7 is capable of carrying nearly 20,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance per aircraft, which is enormous for a strike aircraft. That is over twice what the Mirage 5 could carry, and the Mirage 5 is still a relevant ground attack or strike aircraft. As the JH-7 squadron, all of the missile forces of the Chinese in Mexico that were deployed for this specific invasion sector, namely the 612th, 613th, and even the 616th, which was a Trojan unit, although the 612th and 613th were primarily responsible for assisting in the Battle of Albuquerque, as well as also the Pakistani 176th Missile Artillery Regiment firing the Babur Alpha 1 cruise missiles, and the Iranian paramilitary branch known as their IRGC, which had multiple branches within it, had their IRGC missile forces deploying their 7th Al-Hadid Missile Brigade, responsible for firing both Shahab 1s and 2s, but primarily firing Shahab 2s due to the range from Mexico able to reach Albuquerque. All of these forces had fired immense amounts of missiles at their main target, which was Kirtland Air Force Base, as well as also striking the bivouac sites and the Babur Alpha 1 strikes, taking out the bridges, and later even missiles used in a tactical capacity against American airmen trying to recon the area outside of the International Sunport while still staying within its grounds, as well as also getting hit by Iranian artillery strikes, which were also massive, as their M109A1 howitzers, left over from the Shah era, which equipped the artillery battalions firing batteries of the 3rd Armored Brigade of the Iranian Regular Army, showered the installation with 155 rounds, as well as also the International Sunport with very accurate precision fire guided by the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets in the form of the quadcopter platoon-level drones of the Iranian forces, as well as also the high-altitude drones, which were the Iranian Mohajer-6 armed high-altitude reconnaissance drone, the Chinese WZ-8 high-altitude stealth drone, and the Russian 4-post drone, all orbiting different paths over the battle space to give steady updates of everything happening on the ground, with even satellite overlays on top of them higher up, as all three combined, from the lowest level quadcopter assets to the high altitude drones to the satellite, to provide a complete and total real-time battlefield overlay that was processed by the Sino-Russian AI real-time battlefield data processing system, which crunched multiple domains of data in milliseconds and gave out information rapid fire by the second, as in by the second updates constantly, which economized all the firepower, making firepower usage more efficient, more accurate, more deadly than ever before was possible, as well as also mitigating friendly fire incidents, as well as also making possible certain maneuvers that were never before possible. And as a result, the American defending forces, which even included reactionary armed civilians, were outright slaughtered by Iranian and Pakistani forces, such as these Iranian dismounted armored infantry troops going through the city methodically, annihilating the armed reactionary civilians with the assistance of their quadcopter assets looking in windows and zipping and zooming all around the battlefield, as it were, looking at everything as the operators who operated these drones were professionals who were well trained in their usage at the platoon level, which was impressive for the Iranians to have a full drone doctrine at the platoon level. Although they didn't have it at the squad level yet, for their being a tier 2 power as it pertained to Iran, it was highly impressive. They were far ahead of many in this aspect. Even the Pakistanis, undergoing a military overhaul and having Chinese drones supplied to them at the company level, would take time to train their NCOs at the platoon and squad levels all throughout the entirety of the enormous Pakistani army. So the usage at the company level was still adequate, but the Iranians again were further ahead than the Pakistani allies of the Iranians and Chinese at this battle. As now, the refugees who had fled at the very opening of hostilities, who did not stay to fight and perish like these armed reactionary civilians did, they had fled the entire area, leaving the area of operations. It has to be understood that on day one of the entire nationwide invasion, the top priority at the time was the capture of all of the key nodes, which were the major cities, especially those with installations, as installations were the highest of all priorities and were overrun immediately when the invasion had kicked off. They were the absolute top of the list. But then it was also big and medium and even small cities that were along key invasion routes for the external components, as fourth generation warfare doctrine was followed to the letter. The combination of Trojan shock armies doing the vast majority of the heavy lifting, as it could be said, as these forces were they who were busy capturing all the key objectives, whereas the external component, which used to be the star of the proverbial show as they would cross the borders and they would establish a front line and clash with enemy forces, now they took a back seat to the Trojans. They were simply the reinforcements for the Trojans, as their task was to race up the key invasion routes as fast as humanly possible upon smashing their way across the borders, only fighting initial battles before they were to race deep inland and fan out and assist the Trojans that were the furthest inland, which would in this regard even include the key node of Albuquerque as one of the single biggest megafobs in the entire region in the New Mexico state and even a bit beyond, would be established here in the Kirtland Air Force Base, combined with the Albuquerque Sunport or International Airport, and immediately adjacent to that, the captured nearly fully intact Red Zone. As all of this was immediately connected, the CCP regime, for their colonial ambitions, had really scored high in this regard, having had geographically taken a place that was conveniently all located adjacent to one another, as it pertained to their red zone, as it pertained to the international airport, and the installation that was to become part of the mega fob after a massive rubble clearance operation, after the People's Armed Police would do an enormous roundup as Chinese paramilitary engineering forces were to come in and build a laogai to house all of these slave laborers so that they could clear the rubble and the engineering forces could operate the equipment and assist in setting up the portable buildings and modular building pieces to create other buildings, as well as setting up tents and more, making it a true megafob, as well as establishing the areas which would be motor pools and maintenance facilities and more, as well as also clearing and fixing the runways and the airbase portion of the megafob for use for incoming cargo aircraft. As the refugees, having had the wisdom and foresight to flee very early on in the invasion, trying to get the hell out of the city before their escape was cut off, many fleeing south had witnessed the artillery fire coming from a CCP regime property that was very close to the interstate of I-25, whereupon the PLA 14th Group Army, which was the external component for the area moving into Colorado, as well as also the 18th PAP Light Armor Brigade, which itself was part of the external components, having had fought a hard battle at the border and smashed their way in as well, and moved through Las Cruces with the 14th PLA Group Army before racing to get to Albuquerque. And now they were here and were beginning to establish themselves and prepare for the next phase of their operations, which was to do the enormous roundup of compulsory labor, which is a euphemism for brutal, harsh slave labor services, to build the mega fob. As the refugees that have fled were a mixture of non-combatants and combatants, willing combatants alike, such as those that were armed and fled into the mountains and actually made contact with American remaining forces, which were the pararescue troops of the airmen that were still there from having had been up there training at the time of the invasion's kickoff. Under the tutelage of these airmen and training and organization and leadership, they would mold these armed civilians into something that was actually quasi-formidable, and they would start small with tiny ambushes of foot patrols and work their way up to bigger soft targets like logistical trucks and other types of soft targets and soft-skinned vehicles to get their logistics in order. They would have to start somewhere, and the airmen would guide them as the pararescuemen, again, as always said in this sub-series of the entire series, that they were no pushover. They were very well trained to go behind enemy lines and pick up downed airmen and other individuals, and they were highly trained and motivated to do that task. As the People's Armed Police forces that fought at the border consisted of their Light Armor Brigade with its one artillery battalion consisting of its firing batteries, which were the Towed Type 83 122mm howitzers, as well as only one firing battery of the 130mm, which were larger slightly, the Type 59-I or -1 howitzers, as they would have to take time to set up their artillery battalion on the fob. They were not ready at this point in time just yet to fire, but that was not a problem, as the Iranian forces were already on their CCP regime property where they had been since the start. The headquarters battalion over the entire 3rd Armor Brigade of the Iranian Army would be moving along with the Shorad battalion to fuel up all of their vehicles to get onto I-25 and take it all the way to the new FOB and begin to set up in the new buildings, which would be their command buildings. As they would be en route, or beginning to get ready to be en route rather, the high altitude ISR capabilities, including satellite, had spotted enormous movement to the south, as again, it has to be understood that this early on in the entire invasion, on day one, only hours into it, as it was just now 6 p.m. in the evening, or 18 hours in, it was late afternoon, early evening, and the American militia forces to the south that had been on a series of compounds which were actually out of the way of any of what was going on. They lived in a tertiary area, as in they were way out of the way for the invasion forces, and had not been, as of just yet, dealt with by the invasion forces, as the invasion forces were busy capturing their first major objectives and key nodes, especially larger human settlements, which were cities of all sizes and large towns, especially those which were along interstates, which were key invasion routes or logistical routes. They had not yet branched out as of the moment to clear the tertiary areas and patrol them and set up combat outposts that were way away from their mega fobs. That point would come, but it had not had happened just as of yet, as the People's Armed Police Forces, again, had just gotten to the forward operating base. Their armored infantry troops, after having had fought very hard in the south upon smashing across the border, had settled in, as well as their tankers, which operated the Type 62 Guy, or improved light tanks, which indeed were definitely highly upgraded from their original iteration, had an entirely different turret, better armor, better optics, gun stabilization, a more powerful gun in the form of the 105mm rifled tank gun, which could even fire sabot ammunition of the tungsten variety, which was very powerful even at the 105 caliber, as well as also even depleted uranium ammunition, which could penetrate an Abrams tank from this light tank. The People's Armed Police, again, were passed down their heavy weapons from the PLA, as they were a paramilitary force or parallel military force or structure. The senior colonel, which commanded the 18th PAP, or the 18th PAP Light Armor Brigade, was a rank above colonel, as well as the rank below that being lieutenant colonel, and the rank above him being major general, as it was not uncommon for PAP senior colonels to run brigades, as it was either a senior colonel or sometimes even a major general, which was a brigadier commander. These forces had moved into their command center and now were preparing for a new operation. Again, they were to go out and do mass roundups. However, as in their command center, they were getting feedback that they were seeing enormous dust clouds traveling across the desert. They had spotted with their satellite, within this massive dust cloud, an enormous quantity of civilian vehicles, technicals, in the form of pickup trucks and SUVs with armed men within. In the beds of the trucks, inside the SUVs, racing north into the AO, as they had left their area of compounds, which was further to the south and completely off of this entire AO map. They had spent an hour driving into this area, as the refugees that had hurriedly fled early on had informed them about the CCP regime property. As this property, as we go to the map, was already pre-prepared years before, as an enormous burm was built around this area with the express purpose of housing the entire firing battalion of the 3rd Armored Brigade, as all of their howitzers were stored in these long rows of greenhouses, as well as also even some in the barns as well. And all the logistics and supplies were stored in barns stacked to the rafters, including howitzer shells. There was also another CCP regime property, again, that was that of the headquarters battalion over the entire 3rd Armored Brigade, and they had even more logistics. But they had sent enormous amounts of shells by truck to their artillery battalion to keep it firing throughout the course of the entire campaign, and they still had shells on pallets and powder canisters on pallets, fuses on pallets, along with even boxes of primers in enormous numbers to fire these howitzers, as well as all the POL products they would need to maintain them and keep them going, as well as spare parts. The forces in this area, in the CCP regime property, as they emerged from these rows of greenhouses and moved in and set up their gun lines facing different directions with their M109A1s, these howitzers faced all directions, with each firing platoon taking its own sector of fire, effectively. This was one battery, this was one battery, and this was one battery, as the Iranians were set up in artillery terms like the Americans. They had 6 howitzers per battery, unlike the Chinese, Pakistanis, and Russians who had 8. They had 6. And this was a battery, and again, they had 5 total firing batteries, and they also had their headquarters and support company within their entire battalion, which was, these were all the headquarters platoons of all of these firing batteries within this area. They had set up tents as well for the batteries, for their battery commanders, and they had their FDC vehicles for each firing platoon right here that were getting from the AI, the Sino-Russian AI, getting their fire missions already pre-made for them. They already had pre-made strike packages from the AI sent right to the FDC, who relayed them to the gun line and made the fire extremely rapid and extremely simple, as it did not take a lot of time for a fire mission to come down and be fired as a result. As the coalition air power, all of which was on its 3rd sortie by now, as they'd all returned and refueled, did maintenance, and of course rearmed anything they had already used, which effectively had not been really anything on the 2nd sortie, minus a very small number of air-to-ground munitions. And now they were all completely armed with air-to-ground munitions, minus, of course, 2 air-to-air missiles on each aircraft for self-defense, as it pertained to the Chinese and Pakistani aircraft, even the Mirage 5s, which would also participate in this battle, as the coalition air power would effectively be the decisive factor in completely foiling the American attack plans. As, effectively speaking, the Americans in this militia that had effectively left their compounds further south had decided on an attack plan that was effectively one of high speed. They would race and smash their way onto this property and deploy their forces out of the backs of their trucks and SUVs and start blasting. They would do it somewhat like a high-speed commando operation of sorts, where they would smash through the barbed wire fencing, as this was a ranch property owned by the CCP regime, as again, the barns and structures built on it, the greenhouses, which were hundreds of meters long and in rows, had sheltered the howitzers of the entire battalion effectively, and the supplies, and the house on the farm or on the ranch was effectively the command post of the battalion commander. And these forces had effectively just simply rolled out of their greenhouses and rolled in and set up as soon as the mobilization call had come in. This was a common trend on many CCP regime properties for all kinds of different units. It wasn't just artillery forces. It was also air defense forces and also combat forces who would roll directly out after maintenance and strike their target rapidly, then a matter of minutes to hours, depending on how close they were to go for the jugular. As the howitzers of the artillery forces present of the Iranians were effectively armed with heavy machine guns on their tops of their turrets, like this heavy machine gun on the other side of this periscope, the gunner's periscope for lining up the howitzer, for laying the howitzer properly. The MRAPs, they also utilized a mixture of Chinese and American MRAPs, such as the Max Pro that they had acquired from their Quds force operating in Iraq. They had small numbers of them, but they mostly had the Tiger MRAPs of the Chinese, and they also had some Russian MRAPs as well in their arsenal. But These were also equipped with heavy weapons, like their heavy 12.7 millimeter machine guns on their turrets. And they had a very tall burm with which to hide behind. This burm was about 8 feet high all the way around. As this was constructed again years ago, no Americans even knew what the hell it even was. Nobody understood what this even was, if they even paid attention to it at all, which most obviously did not, as the Iranian troops simply lived on the land and would go out into town like normal people and live amongst the people that they were to conquer one day. And now, when they got their mobilization call, they had all moved their howitzers into place, like this one here on the corner of the burm, such as right here or right up here, and they prepared for their operation to support their own armored troops who were in the city fighting a very tough battle against an opponent that wasn't willing to give up at all. But they persevered, they prevailed, and although they had minor casualties in the grand scheme of things, for the men that were in the units that had lost casualties, it meant something to them. It was a very tough battle, as the Americans, though poorly prepared that they were very tenacious, and they were willing fighters. Although they often were up against heavy weapons that they had no recourse for, they were up against armored phalanxes that they couldn't challenge. They were up against troops that worked in tactical teams in body armor that all cleared their fields of fire as they moved tactically together, as well as also heavy weaponry that the troops were equipped with. And they simply smashed their opponents. They smashed the American forces. They were no match for this type of firepower. They were no match for the ISR capabilities. They were no match for the armor. They were no match for the artillery. They were definitely no match for the air power whatsoever at all, or the missile power. Not to mention even the tanks as well. As now, the PAP, again, as this battle was really about to initiate, and they got the call on their new command post in the international sunport or airport that they had just gotten into, the PAP senior colonel had received notification that a large grouping of Americans were moving across the desert from the south, who had traveled an hour as per the satellite imagery and high altitude drones that could see them from a distance coming. And the PAP commander, the senior colonel, had dispatched one of his light tank companies from one of his armored battalions from within his brigade, as his brigade had multiple armored battalions with armored infantry troops that had the Type 86G tracked infantry fighting vehicles, as well as the Type 63 APCs tracked, as this was a tracked PAP force, including their light tanks, and they had their own towed artillery. They were a very powerful force to be reckoned with for sure, and they were specialists in counterinsurgency. And the PAP, whose artillery, again, was not even set up yet, wouldn't even use their artillery. The Iranians would. The Iranians would utilize their own artillery that would be ISR directed on point, and their own headquarters battalions, dedicated combat drone section, would lob some Shahed 238s airborne to support their artillery forces, who would get up on the machine gun turrets. They would run to the parapets of the burm, take up positions along with the MRAPs, and even the air power to arrive to give them an enormous, decisive edge in the battle, along with also, again, their own artillery and loitering munition strikes. They were well fortified with their burm constructed around them for exactly this possibility. And the howitzers, as a key, important weapon system, needed to be protected at all costs. And as the PAP's forces were moving south, as they sent their light tank company with its platoon level quadcopter assets, as the PAP, unlike the PLA, had usually drones at the platoon level, but some of their units had them at every squad level. But their NCOs at least carried the portable PDA versions of the combat data links so that they could keep up in real time with everything that was going on, as these forces were very powerful in terms of their capabilities with their armor and their artillery, which was not yet set up, as well as their armored infantry. The light tanks would be an enormous boost, even in a company, to assist the Iranian forces who were besieged upon their CCP regime property firing point. As the entire battalion was there, they would be firing their 155 shells at a distance as the trucks were racing and trying to avoid howitzer fire, as the militia leadership were former Iraq and Afghan veterans that knew something about conflict, they knew something about war, but what they didn't know was that the artillery would be ISR directed, the loitering munitions as well. The air power would be devastating, as not even all of the coalition air power would even be used. Even the high-altitude reconnaissance drone, the Mohajer 6, would lob 2 of their Quaim air-to-ground munitions at some of the partisan or militia trucks and destroy them, as this would orbit the area and give steady updates on the battlefield to all the coalition ground forces involved, including even the arriving People's Armed Police tank company with its 20 light tanks and its headquarters platoon, which was not a combat force but was the logistical and command elements of the tank company. As this mauve color-coded rail system here with these track junctions, this is the Rail Runner Amtrak system that runs all the way north into Albuquerque and continues north from there, as the Amtrak lines are the mauve color while the freight lines are brown. The freight lines typically in this city run east to west, whereas the civilian passenger lines run north to south, for those that are interested. As this was the I-25 highway that earlier these very same PAP forces had traveled north upon, they were now on the access road moving south and about to challenge American forces in the area, as some were dismounted and running across the tracks trying to get on this high ground, as this part of New Mexico is rife with sudden high ground, as there were areas with steep elevation, there were even buttes and hills and more, as the area here was full of hilly terrain, as well as some of the sudden high altitude terrain that was more steep, that was a few dozen feet high at its highest height from the road. And as the forces got on top of it, they tried to fire down at the turret machine gunners, who abruptly fired back with their 12.7 millimeter fires, as well as turning the tank turret and loading up frag T-105 millimeter shells, as well as firing the coax machine gun at their targets and cutting them down, as well as using their platoon quadcopter assets to ISR guide their shells, as these tanks, again, had a domestic upgrade from the Marconi fire control system, which was originally in there. It was effectively a Chinese Marconi copy, but the Chinese had improved on this tank decades ago before they had passed it down to the PAP with their own domestic fire control systems, which is why it's called the Type 62G, or Guy light tank. And it has a full gun stabilizer. It has all the amenities any normal tank would have, even though it's a light tank, but is capable of killing main battle tanks with depleted uranium ammunition and also the new tungsten sabot ammunition that the Chinese possess. As they approached and were taking fire, the fire coming down on them was abruptly returned, and again, these shells were assisted by ISR guidance, which programmed back into the combat data link and fire control system and ballistic computer, aiding in the dropping of these tank shells on these forces right over this terrain, hitting and destroying them as they moved, hitting them while they were moving. And they also fired a frag T shell here and blasted them along with heavy machine gun fire as they moved into the area. They hurriedly destroyed these forces as the follow-up tanks cut the rest of these personnel down, moving up and into this high ground. They had already, at the opening, as they arrived, cut these forces down here. And all these forces moving across this roadway here would be destroyed by the tank-based fires, from the heavy machine gun to the coax to the ISR-directed shells, which were mostly frag T shells, which had maximum shrapnel effect and could easily annihilate civilian vehicles with ease. And artillery fire was coming in as well, as a tank fire destroyed this vehicle and temporarily immobilized these long enough for artillery fire to come in directly upon them and destroy them from this firing platoon from one battery right here, as each battery had 2 firing platoons of 3 howitzers each. As now the air power was coming in, as again even the Mohajer 6 lobbed 2 of its Quaim air-to-ground weapons and destroyed these 2 pickup trucks full of personnel. These personnel that were dismounted were now, from their vehicles, were now running up with these pickup trucks who still had people in them and were about to dismount them, along with these 2 right here. As they got here, they dismounted their squads, and these trucks here made it up under the bridge and crashed through the barbed wire fencing just like these forces did here, even these dismounts who were bounding and covering tactically, as again, the militia forces had Iraq and Afghan war vets effectively, ostensibly leading them in this operation. They had planned it for hours. They had waited, thinking that the coalition forces would get very comfortable now that they had captured Albuquerque itself. And to an extent they had, as they were now preparing to round up civilians en masse that were still in the city to force them to live in a laogai as slave laborers to clear rubble, and then do other things to assist in the colonization operations, such as preparing the red zone for new colonists and other economic exploitation operations in the region. But the PAP forces were already and always on high alert. These were the CCP regime fanatics. These were the cream of the crop of the Chinese paramilitary forces. They were effectively like the Waffen-SS, but contemporary form of a heavily armed paramilitary entity, as well as there being other contemporaries similar to the PAP. The PAP did have artillery, they did have heavy weapons, and they had all manner of capabilities in terms of their different weapons types and how they deployed them in battle, as well as also the drone doctrine built into these forces almost every bit as much as it was into the PLA, which was the regular Chinese military. But the PAP was often a force that fought more fanatically and brutally so, and they would show their fanaticism in this battle as well, as the armored forces showed no mercy and hurriedly destroyed enemy forces as soon as they got into the area, and as soon as their quadcopters seen them, they were hurriedly dropping shells and destroying these forces. As the air power was coming in, 4 JH-7s would rake the entire battlefield with 1,000 pounders, free fall 1,000 pounders, so they had a spread on them, as well as also cluster munitions, which would be massively destructive on these columns of vehicles trying to smash their way towards the Iranian artillery forces, who were still laying down fire missions against the intruders that were trying to smash their way in, as some would actually breach the outer fence of this CCP property, which was a simple barbed wire fence, It was nothing special. It was just made to camouflage this as a simple farming or ranching property, and for years it passed, it sufficed. But now these American forces were smashing through it, but these Shahed 238s were destroying a large number of their vehicles, as well as our Iranian artillery fire, getting leads on where they assumed that certain trucks or SUVs would be at any given moment, as this JH-7 would drop 2 laser-guided munitions right here and destroy these vehicles, while an artillery shell would land here as well and destroy these along with the munitions, but the artillery would hit first, which is why there's no red around them. These forces would be destroyed. These forces by then had already smashed their way in along with this. These forces were destroyed by artillery fire and loitering munition strikes here and here as well. As they got in, they deployed the people out of the back of their truck. And as they smashed their way in, the different trucks went in different directions, preparing to deploy their forces out from behind them. But it was too late as cluster munitions came in and pounded this area to oblivion, as well as also 4 1,000 pounders combined with the cluster munitions, which made the area a total kill box, destroying everything. As this force had moved in, the heavy machine gun fire had effectively ripped it up. It got within range and got tore up by heavy machine gun fire. As they moved across and smashed their way in, this MRAP laid down enormous 12.7 millimeter fire, shredding the hell out of that pickup truck, leaving nothing left. The 1,000 pounders here destroyed these vehicles, all 3 of them right here. And Iranian shell again and again, as well as here as well. Iranian shell landed at the same time as this was struck by a Shahed 238, launched again by the soon-to-arrive headquarters battalion as they would come here, as there was enormous fuel reserves here that they would use to fuel up and basically get on the highway and move to their new command post. But this battle had erupted effectively, which would have to be resolved. But this battle would effectively only last a grand total of 1 hour, and that would only be because of some of the movement that it took to even get into this area. This was a Mirage 5, firing 4 odd air-to-ground missiles at incoming vehicles that were further away off this map. This is high ground here. This is higher ground. These forces are being destroyed by Baidu-guided precision munitions dropped by these 2 JF-17Bs, as the coalition again contributed different pairs of aircraft. There was even a pair of J-10s flying over the area, now heavily armed with air-to-ground munitions and ready to strike any enemy forces. However, it would end up being unnecessary, as by now, as all of these forces had been laid waste by the entire myriad of different weapon systems, they would put up a very, very small effort as they would fire into these Iranian barns, which were full of supplies, and they would damage some supplies. They would even kill an Iranian soldier right here, and they would wound some others. And the armored ambulances would pick up the wounded, and of course the combat medics were busy pulling out wounded here. These were combat medics. This was all the headquarters company of the entire battalion that was in this area, managing the logistics and supplies, as well as commanding the battalion from the commander's farmhouse here. These are all fuel trucks lined up. Again, enormous fuel reserves all in these trucks, as well as being barrels of fuels, all kinds of barrels of fuels inside of these barns, as well as in some of the trucks. They were to fuel up the headquarters forces so that they again could take their position in the command post, and they would be followed by the SHORAD air defense forces that no longer had a purpose other than to effectively protect the headquarters battalion en route into the soon-to-be megafob, and they would set their air defense forces up. Although there was no real air threat remaining, they would do so just out of general principle because it was their job. And now, as these forces had fired into the Iranians, these forces had gotten here and laid down fire against the Iranians right here as they had attacked and deployed forces from these vehicles. They were outside of the range of all of this enormous, heavy munitioning, I'll call that. as the heavy machine gun fire, as well as the turret fire from the tops of these artillery pieces, was enormous, and the loitering munition strikes likewise enormous from the headquarters battalion's dedicated combat drone section, as they were now en route to get their fuel, but they would postpone their arrival and wait for this battle again to resolve itself, as there was an exchange of fire that lasted some time against these Americans that pulled up and smashed through the area here, and these infiltrators that crossed in through the fence and bounded and covered tactically. They were laying down fire, and they were laying down all the small arms fire they could manage at this area here. Now, they would wound a few soldiers that were up on the parapets here. They were part of these gun crews, and they were effectively not bringing shells at the moment, and they got up on the parapets to fire over them for the moment. And as they would fire here, and these vehicles got to this position here, they were all returning fire for a brief moment, but the heaviest firepower that was ISR directed would win the day, and that effectively was the howitzer-based heavy machine guns, as well as also even the troops with their rocket-propelled grenades, and also their PKM with their image-intensifying and red dot sight optics and more that the Iranians possess, such as even the Kornet anti-tank missiles. They simply wiped out these forces. They couldn't bore sight their howitzers quite properly because of the height of the burm, but they could at least fire a short distance with the minimum green charge that they possessed, but with the right angle and traverse, that is. But they effectively would only fire one shell here and a few over this way to hit other trucks that were behind this grouping right here, as these howitzers are all firing. These howitzers would effectively just vector heavy machine gun fire into this direction from their gun line. Well, at least the first two. The other one in the line couldn't do it because it was not safe. But as these forces ran and took their position on the embankment, and these trucks came in for safety, the battle had ended, again, very fast. This was an hour-long battle, and the only reason, again, it lasted so long was all of the movement, the PAP forces fighting their own part of it, as well as also all of these different American forces here moving into and engaging with the Iranians in a somewhat drawn-out firefight that lasted a number of minutes. All in all, again, this battle lasted 1 full hour, and the reason why the militia forces failed, as in an after-action review of their actions, they failed because they were attacking across open ground against an enemy that has satellite technology, high-altitude ISR capabilities from drones, and also quadcopter assets for real-time battlefield mapping at the lowest levels, all of which all overlay to present the full picture of the entire battlefield at any given moment. As all of these aircraft and the artillery fire, as well as the loitering munition strikes, all came in, as well as also all the machine gun, the crew serve machine gun and small arms fire, and rocket-propelled grenade fire, and cornet fire in some cases. It was just too much. The attack, although there were thousands of attackers here moving into this area to attack the artillery forces, there were literally over 2,000 attackers rolling in vehicles from their compounds to the south. They crossed a large area. They traveled 1 hour. They were already seen as they were leaving in a big group. They were already spotted by the satellites, the military satellites of China and other allies. They were then spotted by the high-altitude assets as they were about 30 minutes out. And then as they arrived in the area, the PAP had already dispatched a company to race down the access road to support the Iranians as a relief force, yet again, using their light tanks to crush the militia-type forces, which they did, at least in their particular area of the battle, as the battle occurred over a large area. This is a large area. This is a 2-mile area by 1-mile area north to south. This was an enormous CCP property, CCP ranch near the highway, as this is the access road moving north, it's the access road moving south. This is the highway, this is the underpass of the bridge right here. The air power was enormous and simply crushed the American forces beneath its might, with the cluster munitions and 1,000-pounders used by the PLAAF, or the Chinese Air Force, the JH-7s. Even the J-10s were prepared to drop their air-to-ground ordnances that they'd been heavily laden with for their third sortie as well. The JF-17Bs also dropped their returning payloads, which were air-to-ground oriented by now, with very few air-to-air munitions, such as just 2 to defend themselves if need be due to SOP. But the strike aircraft, the fighter aircraft retasked now as ground attack aircraft or strike aircraft, and the dedicated, extremely powerful JH-7s, which also provided the electronic warfare assets to this entire battlefield, did the lion's share of the destruction here. And that wasn't even the entire squadron. It was only 2 pairs of aircraft from the 12 aircraft squadron. Had it been the entire squadron, they could have done the entire destruction all by themselves. But it was all the Allies working together, and they had an ease of communications, yet again, because of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, and made communications between these different allies that all speak different languages exceedingly easy, as it were. So, this ends the battle in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as the coalition forces have captured the entire area of operations and now would establish their megafob all within day number 1. This 20-hour battle within the scope of the 4-day invasion has now ended with a crushing defeat of armed reactionary civilians who were tenacious and tried as they could not overcome the superiority in air power, artillery firepower, loitering munitions power, and artillery, all combined, not to mention the light tanks as they arrived into the area to assist. All of this was hellishly destructive, and the coalition prevailed while thousands of Americans lay dead and only 2 Iranians perished in the entire battle, with several wounded, and that was it. A massive crushing defeat for the Americans and a massive victory for the coalition forces, as they now had Albuquerque again under complete total control, as the Pakistani 18th ID, the Iranian 3rd Armor Brigade, and the PAP's 18th Light Armor Brigade would now begin to police their area of operations first, conduct their new objectives of mass roundups, their construction projects, and then they would branch out and establish combat outposts and clear the tertiary areas of all insurgents and partisans. That would be the order of their operations once the 4-day battle had ended and the entire nationwide victory had been achieved by the coalition.